This episode, I'm gonna make a ruined tower an excellent place for bad guys to set up, get some high ground, get some cover, and shoot some arrows at those pesky PCs. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Blackmagic Craft. Remember in my modular ruins video where I talked about how I did not want to make static ruined buildings and I wanted to keep everything modular? Well, this episode I'm going to do the complete opposite and throw my own advice out the window because I want to make a ruined tower. And this is one of the times where I think it's okay to not be modular. And the reason for that is a round tower is a very specific item. I don't need many different setups of round towers. Usually there's only going to be one of them in an encounter. So I figured it was okay to make a dedicated building in this circumstance because also I don't want to make modular round walls. That's kind of a pain in the ass. So this week I am going to build a ruined tower. I'm going to do it in such a way that it is going to be very playable. It's big enough to have an encounter in. It's got multi-levels so that you can set up some bad guys on the upper high ground. It's going to be usable for just a regular tower. If I ever really want to just have a normal tower, I just spin this thing around, use the front of it, say it's not ruined, and it's a stand-in for all my circular building needs. Before we jump into this build, I want to say a quick thank you to the sponsors of this video. And who is that? That's the fine folks who support Blackmagic Craft on Patreon. It is because of them and their generosity that I am able to make these videos. So if you love these videos that I make for the community, you have those people to thank, because if it wasn't for their support, these videos would not happen. Full stop. If it was not for Patreon, this channel would end. So thank you guys for all of your generosity. For those of you that have been considering backing Blackmagic Craft on Patreon, maybe now's the time. Let's build a badass looking ruined tower. I started this project by making a metric butt ton of little bricks, and I did this using the same method that I did in my modular ruins video. So if you haven't seen that one yet, head on over and check that one out to see the whole process of making these little bricks. Using some 1/2" XPS insulation foam and my PROXXON HOTWIRE table and the circle cutting jig from shiftinglands.com, I created a base from this tower. I wanted a large, solid circle on which I could build these circular walls. How big is this circle? I don't know, I don't remember. It was as big as I could get out of this scrap piece of foam. Using that circle as a guide, I started to construct my walls. I just attached my bricks using hot glue. I did a double layer wall and started building up the sections. Also, once I got to the 4th row, I kept something in mind that a viewer mentioned on my previous ruins video, and that is that on brick walls like this, there should be a course of bricks that runs the other direction to tie them together. And that makes a lot of sense. So I figured, hey, why not do that here, make it more realistic? I realized that doing this on a circle was probably not the best place to do it for the first time because it created a lot of kind of crappy gaps and whatever, but hey, here's one kind of realistic course of bricks to tie them together. I gave up and didn't do any more later in the build. Once the walls got to the height of what would be appropriate for the 2nd story, I put in some wooden joists using coffee stir sticks. Doing it at this point now was a lot easier than doing it later. I could just cut a little groove in the bricks and glue the stir sticks in place, and this would make them really strong, and they would be there and ready for when I wanted to put on the wood plank floor later. Then I continued to build the walls, and at this height is where I put the arrow slits, because the whole point of this tower was playability, so it was really important to me that there was a place that enemies could fire from. So to make the arrow slits, I just did something really easy, which was create some square cubes. I then cut them into little triangular pieces and glued them in place. So what this did was create a small slit on the exterior of the tower and a wider opening on the interior of the tower for the archer to stand. Then with those in place, I infilled the bricks between them. After doing some testing with a Mini, I realized these needed to be taller, so I made them 2 of these wedges high, and they created the perfect arrow slits. I capped off the tops of these with 1 solid brick so there wasn't a mortar joint right above the opening, and then I continued building my walls. I didn't really like how some of the really big gaps in the brickwork looked, so I filled some of them in using some tiny wedges of foam. Not all of them, just the worst offenders. It was then time to start decorating the floor, and I wanted a kind of more interesting pattern than just 1-inch squares, so I cut some tiny little bricks, some of these being true squares and some of them being rectangles. I coated the entire bottom of the foam using Eileen's tacky glue, and then I started laying flooring in my pattern of choice. I didn't worry much about getting it perfect around the perimeter because I knew that I would be covering this with rubble. And in fact, some of the worst spots I just covered with a couple extra fallen bricks. I wanted the floor to be totally blown out on the back end of this thing, so I marked out the shape that I wanted and I took the whole thing to my PROXXON and I just hacked out a big chunk of the floor using the hot wire, which was very oddly satisfying. Because I wanted the base to look like it was blown up stone or concrete, the smooth hot wire cut wasn't entirely appropriate, so using a knife and my fingernail, I just kind of ripped out tiny pieces of the foam to give it a more crumbled stone look. To hide the circular base, I cut some larger foundation stones and glued them around the edge. Using my X-ACTO knife, I kind of chamfered all the edges to give them a slightly more weathered look. I wanted to add a little bit more visual interest to this thing, so I made some decorative features using various strips of foam. Then I decided to test something that was quite risky to do. I'm never a fan of how hot glue leaves little wisps all over a project, and I know that one of the ways you can get rid of this is by using a heat gun. However, a heat gun will also melt and deform styrofoam. So I decided that I would take my heat gun to this piece, melt away the wisps, and try to sort of control melt all the bricks to weather them even further. You have to be incredibly careful doing this because in just a matter of seconds, your bricks will go from slightly deformed to totally melted away. There's a bizarrely specific breaking point on the temperature where it goes from 0 to 100, so you have to use a lot of caution. The nice thing about this is that afterwards, all this foam is cauterized and very, very hard. Again, I wasn't happy with how large some of the gaps were on the foundation stones and the decorative adornments that I added, so I filled those in using a sort of mortar that I made out of watered down joint compound. I just forced some of this into the cracks and using a wet brush wiped away all the excess. If you're gonna do this, you have to be careful to try and do a really neat and clean job so that it doesn't look like everything is just covered in mud. In order to complete the ruined look, I used some construction sand to kind of decorate all of the edges of this piece. Just used some PVA glue and sprinkled on the sand in order to look like rubble and hide any more gaps that might be showing where the floor meets the walls. Then it was time for painting, and before I paint any of my projects, I always prep them using Mod Podge and black paint. This acts as a hardening coat as well as a sort of primer, and it will protect the foam for years to come. To paint this thing, I did the exact same paint job I did on my modular ruin set because I wanted them to match, and that was just a base coat in a dark gray
and then a dry brushing with a light tan and a final dry brushing of a white. Then I gave the whole piece a coating in a very dark blackish brown wash. I put that aside to dry and got to work on the wood planks for the floor. Yes, I have not forgotten about those. To make these, I used some coffee stir sticks, and I weathered them and kind of shaped them the same way I did in my Goblin Barricades video using a rotary tool. I beveled the edges and made them look, well, not like coffee stir sticks. Then I pre-painted all of the wood stir sticks using a really watered down brown. Once they were dry, I could start installing them. And I actually wanted to add one more joist so that I could make the floor a little bit bigger, but this was one that I didn't want to span all the way across. So I just cut a little groove using my X-ACTO knife in the bricks, used a bit of glue, and poked the coffee stirrer into the wall, and it held surprisingly strong. I could then cut my stir sticks to length and start installing them. I just put a bead of PVA glue down on the joist, cut my pieces to length, and put them in place. On the ends that were exposed, I broke them so that they had a kind of destroyed look to them and they didn't look like clean cuts. Once all of the planks were in place, I gave them the same dark brown black wash that I gave on the rest of the piece. And you can see here that I also had added some broken pieces of timber on the main floor. The last painting step was to give the whole thing a very light dry brushing using the same light tan that I had used previously. And I went over everything here. I went over all of the stonework as well as the wood. And on the wood, this light tan made the wood look a lot more aged and weathered, giving it that nice little gray touch. After that, I took the piece outside and I gave it a spray with MINWAX polyurethane in a satin finish. This is my go-to clear coat for terrain. It locks in all of the paint, makes the foam a little bit harder, and I find that it kind of enhances the color in a way that I like. I really like the way this project came out, and I think it will complement my modular ruin set very nicely. It's nice when you have a bit of terrain that is very playable in the sense that it can actually add dynamic interaction to an encounter. There's some high ground, there's some cover, and that can be really fun to use as a DM, but more importantly, it's going to be really fun for your players to play on. If you need to pick up any of the tools or supplies that I use to complete this build, go on over to blackmagicraft.ca, where I have my essential equipment store with links to all of the tools and supplies that I use and recommend. Purchasing through those links on Amazon helps to fund these videos. Again, I want to say a huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon. It is because of you guys that I'm able to fulfill my dream of making these videos for the community. Thank you so much. Without you, these videos would not be possible. If you want to help support the channel in that same way, check out my Patreon page and consider backing. I would love to have you as the newest member of the Black Magic Craft Fellowship.
That's it, guys. One badass ruined tower complete. As you can see, it's not a very complicated build. It looks really interesting and really cool, but realistically, it's not that hard to build. Doesn't use any expensive materials. It's a little bit tedious to put together, but it's something that you could definitely bang off in a weekend. I think your players will be pretty impressed when you throw it on the table. If you found this video useful and inspiring, and I hope that you did, hit that like button and drop me a comment below. Of course, if you're new here and you are not subscribed, hit subscribe. Check out my back catalog. I got like 100 terrain building videos of neat stuff for you to check out. That's it for this week, guys. Cheers, happy crafting, and happy gaming.